The U.S. has a long-standing relationship with the death penalty, the first state execution being that of the convicted spy Captain George Kendall in 1608. Since then, thousands upon thousands of others have faced the wrath of the state. In the past, people could be executed for a wide array of crimes, from the heinous like rape and murder to the trivial such as forgery, and to the ridiculous like witchcraft. There was a move in the late 1800s to only execute those who have committed a severe and planned out crime, but unfortunately nearly 13,500 people have lost their lives by order of the government from the years of 1608 to 1949, but at least these people had the decency of a quick execution. Prior to the mid-20th century, those who were sentenced to execution had to wait only a short amount of time to be executed. It was common to have to wait a few days to a couple months in later cases. Take the case of famous abolitionist John Brown, for example. He led a raid on Harper's Ferry in October of 1859 that led to the death of 16 people, 10 of which being his own. He had a short trial and was convicted on November 2nd, 1859, then hung only a month later on December 2nd, 1859. Or Rainey Bethia, who was convicted of the rape of an elderly woman on June 25, 1936, and subsequently hung publicly on August 14th of the same year. An estimated 20,000 people came to witness his death in Owensboro, Kentucky. A gruesome spectacle has been described as once Bethia dropped to his death, the crowd rushed the gallows trying to rip off a piece of clothing from the dead man's hanging body. Luckily, this event marks the end of public executions in the U.S. Executions prior to the mid-20th century were notably fast. The convicted people of the past would not have to live with the knowledge of their deaths for very long, but many people would argue that to only have a few months between sentencing and execution leaves room for errors to occur, and innocent people to be executed. It was during the 20th century that the United States started to consider this concern and come up with laws preventing it. In 1972's Furman v. Georgia, the U.S. Supreme Court placed a de facto moratorium, that's a temporary hold on a law, on the death penalty until a set of guidelines could be set and achieved by every state. However, the moratorium was later removed in the Supreme Court's decision in Gregg v. Georgia. Capital punishment was reinstated with new laws designed to make sure all criminals receive a fair trial and due process by law. This law was made to protect the lives and liberties of those who were sentenced to death, and yet after its implementation, there was an increase in the amount of deaths by suicide and an increase in the people waiving their rights and asking to be executed sooner. After being jailed for nearly 10 years after his sentencing in 1975, Charles Rumbaugh had become suicidal and asked for his execution to be moved up. During his sanity hearing in 1985, he exclaimed, "If they don't want to do it, I'll make them shoot me. I think I'll make them shoot me right now." Charles then charged a U.S. Marshal who promptly shot him. Rumbaugh survived this injury, and the court promptly decided to move up his execution. Another case of this strange behavior can be seen in the case of prisoner Michael Ross. After being on death row for 18 years, Michael also became suicidal and asked for his execution to be hastened. After some questioning about his mental capability on coming up with such a decision, Ross was eventually granted what he wanted and executed on May 13, 2005. An astonishing 11% of those executed in the US have asked to abandon their appeals in order to die sooner. One would expect that every person on death row would try to appeal as much as possible in order to stay alive for as long as they could, and yet a staggering amount have asked to die sooner. Why would this be? What kind of conditions must these people endure that forces some to suicidal actions? Prisoners on death row are treated very differently than those with lesser sentences. Always on solitary confinement, their cells are segregated and tiny, usually around 6 foot by 9 foot by 9.5. They are forced to be trapped in these cells for as many as 23 hours per day, alone with only their thoughts and maybe a small television or radio. As one can imagine, these types of conditions will take effect on a person after 15 to 20 years. A few quotes from the men on death row. Tedrick Batiste, who has since denied his federal appeals. "I look out the window into the dark sky, into nothing, wishing I will find something." Jeff Wood, who is still fighting to get off death row. "You deal with it, or you kill yourself." Richard Glossip, who survived a botched execution in 2016 and has since gotten married behind bars in 2018. "I've seen people who have not been able to deal with this, and the hell it is." All these men are describing symptoms of death row phenomenon. Death row phenomenon can be described as there being a higher rate of depression and suicidal thoughts among prisoners on death row than normal prisoners. This higher rate is directly related to the two atrocities of death row: the length of time a prisoner has to wait to die, and the deplorable conditions that a prisoner has to face on death row. This phenomenon affects many on death row and has been cited in the prevention of many people's executions. Michael Ross's first execution was delayed because he was thought to be incompetent to waive his rights due to him suffering from death row phenomenon. Many believe that capital punishment now violates the Eighth Amendment, for it is thought that the conditions of death row are causing this death row phenomenon, therefore punishing these men in a cruel way. More and more people have begun to recognize this, and so more advocacy for better treatment of death row prisoners have come about. But what can be said about the prisoners of the past? In what ways were the mental health of these people treated? In the past, the mental health of people on death row really wasn't a priority. The only thing that states cared about was that the prisoner was deemed competent before their execution. If a person was considered incompetent prior to the execution, it posed a problem for psychiatrists. Some did not believe in the necessity of treating these people, for the treatment of their alms would only extend their suffering. Others were not so cruel, but still had to come up with a solution in the quickest way possible. Rush treatment would be administered in an attempt to bring the patient back to what was considered a normal mental state. Some will argue that the effects that death row phenomenon has on a person is just part of the punishment for the prisoner, that it is what they signed up for when committing the crime that would hurt so many people in the first place. But increased awareness towards the subject has started to see success in the betterment of treatment of inmates. Oklahoma State Penitentiary has come under fire for the deplorable conditions of their death row patients. Being housed in underground facilities for up to 24 hours per day with no contact visitations and no outdoor recreation areas, prisoner rights organizations threatened to sue. In response, Oklahoma agreed to move the prisoners into rooms with windows, build chained outdoor recreation cells for exercise, and allow some contact visitations. All will be of great use towards the mental health of these people. Prisons such as San Quentin in California have been experimenting with group therapy programs for prisoners in need. These patients are labeled as enhanced outpatients, or EOP, and are taken from their cells 4 to 5 times per week. They are led to a group room in chains. In these rooms, they are locked inside another cage, but with several other prisoners. In this room, they all meet with a psychotherapist for 2 hours in a group therapy setting. The prison reports that they are having some difficulties with determining true EOP patients and those who are just looking for more time out of their cells, as well as the stigmatization from other inmates who bully those who attend therapy sessions. But they are finding that the therapy is having remarkable success with many of the patients, citing that more of them are compliant with taking their medications and are showing less symptoms of mental illness. The United States of America remains one of the few modern countries who still holds on to the practice of capital punishment, and in an attempt to better the lives of those who are sentenced to death, the state has created a new form of cruel and unusual punishment. Prisoners on death row were intended to be punished by death, not to slowly rot away in their cells until the state finally comes around to putting them out of their misery. The mental health of these condemned prisoners deteriorates over time because they must live in inhumane conditions for decades, with the fear of death hanging over their heads the entire time. The United States and its citizens have not cared about these people until very recently. Small actions are finally being done to help prisoners live more humanely until they are finally executed. One can only hope that this trend catches on and continues towards a better future.